What would you do if Dean Martin walked into your wedding ceremony and stopped everything on June 12, 1972? That's exactly what happened to two strangers in Las Vegas. What he did next wasn't just unexpected. It became the most magical moment in the history of the Sands Hotel. And 50 years later, their grandson revealed why that one moment changed 3 generations of their family forever. It was a Tuesday evening in Las Vegas, and the Sands Hotel was buzzing with its usual electric energy. The casino floor was packed with gamblers. The restaurants were filled with tourists, and in the main showroom, Dean Martin was getting ready for his second show of the night. He was at the peak of his career, selling out every performance. And that night was no different. 3,000 people had paid top dollar to see the King of Cool do what he did best. But what nobody knew was that in the small chapel on the 3rd floor of the Sands Hotel, something much more personal was taking place. A young couple, Thomas and Catherine Reynolds, were about to get married. They weren't wealthy. They weren't famous. They were just 2 kids in love who had saved every penny they had to afford a simple ceremony in Las Vegas. Thomas was 24 years old, a construction worker from Ohio. Catherine was 22, a school teacher with dreams bigger than her bank account. They had $300 to their name, and they'd spent $150 of it just to rent the chapel for 1 hour. There was no band, no singer, no fancy decorations, just a small room with 10 wooden chairs, a simple altar, and a justice of the peace who had already performed 6 weddings that day. Catherine's sister Mary had driven 12 hours from Ohio to be there. Thomas had no family present. His parents had passed away years earlier, and his older brother was stationed overseas in the military. This wedding was supposed to be quiet, simple, and quick. Get married, take a few photos, and head back to their motel room. That was the plan. Dean Martin had finished his first show at 7 p.m. and had 2 hours before his next performance at 9 p.m. He usually spent that time in his dressing room, relaxing with his band, and maybe taking a short nap. But that night, Dean was restless. He decided to walk through the hotel, something he rarely did. He liked watching people when they didn't know he was watching. It reminded him of his early days before the fame, when he was just Dino Crocetti from Steubenville, Ohio. As Dean walked through the casino, he noticed something unusual. Near the elevators, he saw a young woman in a simple white dress. She was crying. Not the happy tears you see at weddings, but the kind of tears that come from disappointment. Standing next to her was a young man in an ill-fitting suit that was clearly borrowed. He was trying to comfort her, but he looked just as sad. Dean stopped walking. He watched them for a moment. The woman wiped her eyes with a wrinkled tissue. The man pulled her close and whispered something in her ear. Then Dean heard it. Just a few words, but they hit him like a punch to the chest. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I know you wanted to give me more. I know you wanted music and dancing and everything special, but this is enough. You're enough." That's when Dean Martin made a decision that would change 4 lives forever. He walked directly up to the couple. Thomas and Catherine looked up, startled. For a moment, they didn't recognize him. They were too caught up in their own emotions. But when Dean spoke, his voice was unmistakable. "Excuse me, folks. I couldn't help but notice you two look like you're heading somewhere important." Catherine's eyes went wide. She grabbed Thomas's arm. "Oh my God, Tommy. That's Dean Martin." Thomas stammered. "Mr. Martin, we're sorry if we're in the way." Dean smiled, that famous smile of his. "You're not in the way at All pal. In fact, I think I'm the one. Who's in the way? Am I correct in guessing you two are about to get married? Catherine nodded, still in shock. Yes, sir. In about 15 minutes, up in the chapel on the 3rd floor. Dean looked at her dress, then at Thomas's suit, then at Mary, standing awkwardly behind them, holding a small bouquet of daisies that looked like they'd been bought at a gas station. And let me guess, Dean said, his voice gentle. You're doing this without all the fancy stuff. No band, no singer, just you two. And love. Thomas felt embarrassed. We don't have much money, Mr. Martin, but we have each other. That's what matters. Dean put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. You know what, kid? You're absolutely right. That is what matters. But here's the thing. He paused, looking between the two of them. I grew up with nothing. I know what it's like to want to give someone you love the world but only have pocket change to offer. And I also know that sometimes when you least expect it, a little magic shows up. Catherine was crying again, but this time they were different tears. Mr. Martin, are you saying I'm saying? Dean interrupted that I've got about 90 minutes before I have to be on stage and I can't think of a better way to spend them than making sure you two have a wedding you'll never forget. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to sing at your ceremony. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas couldn't speak. Catherine covered her mouth with both hands. Mary dropped the bouquet. You want to sing at our wedding? Thomas finally managed to say. I don't want to, Dean said with a wink. I need to. Trust me on this now. Come on. We've got a chapel waiting and I've got a song in my heart. What happened next became the stuff of legend at the Sands Hotel. Dean Martin, one of the biggest stars in the world, walked into that small chapel on the 3rd floor. The justice of the peace nearly had a heart attack. Dean didn't ask permission. He didn't make a big announcement. He simply walked to the front of the room, positioned himself near the altar, and nodded to Thomas and Catherine. All right, let's get you two married. The ceremony began. The justice of the peace stumbled through his lines, clearly nervous, with Dean Martin standing 3 feet away from him. Thomas held Catherine's hands, both of them shaking. Mary sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe what was happening. And then came the moment that would be remembered for 5 decades, when the justice of the peace said, "You may kiss the bride." Dean Martin began to sing. He sang, "Everybody Loves Somebody." Without a microphone, without a band, without anything except his voice and his heart. The acoustics in that small chapel made his voice sound like it was coming from heaven itself. Every word was filled with so much warmth, so much genuine emotion that it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a blessing. Catherine buried her face in Thomas's chest and sobbed. Thomas held her tight, his own eyes wet with tears. Mary was openly weeping. Even the justice of the peace had to wipe his eyes. When Dean finished the song, he walked over to the newlyweds and shook Thomas's hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds. You take care of this lady. She's a gem." Then he turned to Catherine and kissed her hand. "And you, Mrs. Reynolds, you've got yourself a good man. I can tell you two are going to be very happy." Catherine found her voice. "Mr. Martin, I don't know how to thank you." Dean smiled. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. Just love each other. That's all the thanks I need. Oh, and one more thing." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to Thomas. "Go have a nice dinner tonight somewhere fancy on me." Thomas tried to refuse. Mr. Martin, we can't. Yes, you can, Dean said firmly. But kindly. And you will. Now go enjoy your wedding night, and congratulations. Again. Dean Martin walked out of that chapel as quietly as he had entered. He went back to his dressing room prepared for his 9 p.m. show and never mentioned what happened to anyone in his crew. He didn't tell the press. He didn't use it for publicity. He just did it because it felt like the right thing to do. Thomas and Catherine Reynolds that night left the Sands Hotel in a daze. They used the $100 to have dinner at the hotel's finest restaurant, a place they never could have afforded on their own. They ordered champagne, steak, and dessert. They talked about what had just happened, replaying every moment, every word, every note of that song. Do you think anyone will believe us? Catherine asked. Thomas laughed. Probably not, but I don't care. We know what happened. That's all that matters. But here's the incredible part of this story. The part that nobody knew until 50 years later. Dean Martin's act of kindness didn't just give them a beautiful memory. It changed the entire path of their lives. That night, sitting in that fancy restaurant, Thomas and Catherine made a promise to each other. They promised that they would never forget what Dean Martin had done for them. And they promised that whenever they had the chance, they would do the same kind of thing for someone else. They would look for people who needed a little magic in their lives, and they would provide it, no questions asked. Over the next 5 decades, Thomas and Catherine Reynolds became known in their community in Ohio as the couple who helped everyone. They paid for strangers' groceries. They helped young couples with wedding expenses. They donated to every charity that came their way. They opened their home to people who needed a place to stay. They lived modestly, but they gave generously. Their children grew up watching this behavior and did the same themselves. Their grandchildren learned the same values. The ripple effect of what Dean Martin did in that chapel on June 12, 1972, spread across 3 generations. But Thomas and Catherine never told anyone the full story. Not their children, not their friends, not even their pastor. They kept Dean Martin's kindness as their own private treasure, something sacred between the two of them until 2022. On June 12, 2022, exactly 50 years after their wedding, Thomas and Catherine's family threw them a huge anniversary party. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all gathered at a banquet hall in Ohio. It was a beautiful celebration of a marriage that had lasted half a century. During the party, their grandson Michael stood up to give a speech. He talked about his grandparents' generosity, their kindness, their unwavering love for each other and for everyone around them. And then he said something that made the entire room go silent. I never understood where Grandma and Grandpa learned to be so giving. They always just said it was the right thing to do. But last month, while helping Grandma clean out some old boxes, I found a photograph. It was from their wedding day. And on the back of that photograph were 5 words that I didn't understand. The day Dean saved us. Michael pulled out the photograph and held it up. It was a blurry amateur shot, taken by Mary with a cheap camera. But there, clear as day, was Dean Martin, standing next to Thomas and Catherine in that small chapel. So I asked Grandma about it, Michael continued, his voice shaking, and she told me a story I'll never forget. Catherine stood up, tears already streaming down her face. Thomas, now 74 years old, and using a cane, stood beside her, and for the first time in 50 years, they told the complete story of what Dean Martin had done for them. The room was speechless. Some People cried. Some people laughed in disbelief. But everyone understood. Finally, why Thomas and Catherine had spent their entire lives giving to others. Dean Martin didn't just sing at our wedding, Thomas said, his voice still strong despite his age. He taught us what it means to be truly generous. He didn't do it for publicity. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he saw two kids who needed a little magic and he had the power to give it. That lesson shaped everything we became. Catherine added, every time we helped someone over the years, every time we gave when we didn't have much to give, we thought about that night. We thought about Dean standing in that chapel singing with all his heart for an audience of 3. That's real love. That's real generosity. And that's what we wanted our lives to represent. The story of Dean Martin stopping that wedding spread quickly after the anniversary party. Michael posted about it on social media and it went viral. News outlets picked it up. Entertainment historians researched it and former staff members of the Sands Hotel came forward with their own memories of that night. One former security guard, now 89 years old, said, I remember Dean coming back from somewhere that night before his 9 p.m. show. He had this look on his face like he'd just done something wonderful. He was humming Everybody Loves Somebody to himself. I asked him if he was okay, and he just smiled and said, I just remembered why I got into this business. I never knew what he meant until I read this story. A former hotel concierge recalled, the chapel coordinator came down to the lobby that night absolutely beside herself. She kept saying, you won't believe what just happened. Dean Martin just sang at a wedding in our chapel. We all thought she was joking or drunk, but she insisted it was true. The next day she tried to tell the hotel manager, but he didn't believe her either. It became this urban legend among the staff. But for Thomas and Catherine Reynolds, it was never a legend. It was the most real, most beautiful moment of their lives. In the final interview Catherine gave before she passed away in 2023, she was asked what she would say to Dean Martin if she could see him again. She smiled, that same smile she had on her wedding day. I would tell him, thank you. Not just for the song, though that was beautiful, but thank you for showing us that fame and success mean nothing if you don't use them to lift others up. Thank you for seeing two scared kids and deciding they mattered. Thank you for being the kind of man who would walk away from 3,000 paying fans to make two strangers feel loved. She paused, wiping away tears, and I would tell him that because of what he did, we spent 50 years trying to be a little bit like him. We tried to see people who needed magic, and we tried to provide it. We weren't famous. We didn't have his talent, but we had his lesson. And that changed everything. The story of Dean Martin and the Reynolds wedding is more than just a heartwarming tale. It's a reminder of what true generosity looks like. It's not about big gestures for the cameras. It's not about getting credit or recognition. It's about seeing a moment where you can make a difference and choosing to act even when nobody's watching. Dean Martin never publicized what he did that night. He never mentioned it in interviews. He never used it to boost his image. He simply did it because it was the right thing to do. And that, perhaps more than any song he ever sang or any movie he ever made, is the real legacy of Dean Martin. Today, the chapel where Dean Martin sang for Thomas and Catherine Reynolds no longer exists. The Sands Hotel was demolished in 1996, but the impact of what happened in that small room on June 12, 1972, lives on in 3 generations of the Reynolds family, in the countless people They've helped over the years and in everyone who hears this story and decides to do something kind for a stranger. Because that's what Dean Martin taught us that night. Everybody loves somebody. And sometimes when we're lucky, somebody loves everybody.